You're back. And this time we're not walking into a city at its peak of glory or a temple about to be swallowed by fire. We're walking into a field. It's the morning of November 19th, 1863, and the air over a small Pennsylvania town is cold enough that you can see your breath. Thousands of people are gathering on a gentle hillside, dressed in dark wool coats, stamping their feet against the chill, still able to smell the faint, lingering scent of churned earth and horse and gunpowder that 4 months earlier had meant something far worse than a crowd. Bands are tuning their instruments. Local dignitaries are arranging themselves near a wooden platform. Somewhere in that crowd, notebooks are open, pencils ready, because everyone expects the day's real speech to come from a famous orator who will talk for nearly 2 hours. Almost no one in that crowd yet understands that the words which will actually be remembered a century and a half later are going to come from a tall, tired man near the back of the program, and that he will speak for barely 2 minutes. Using AI reconstructions, restored photographs, and paintings from the period, we're going to walk this ground together as it looked that day, and then, before we're done, I'll show you exactly what this same ground looks like right now in the present day so you can see it for yourself. To understand why this place and this moment mattered so much, we have to go back decades earlier, to when this spot was nothing more than a quiet crossroads. In the 1780s, a settler named Samuel Gettys opened a tavern where several old wagon roads happened to intersect. In the rolling farm country of south-central Pennsylvania, 10 different roads would eventually radiate outward from that single crossing point, linking farming communities, market towns, and trade routes across the region. Gettys' son later laid out a formal town grid around the crossroads, and by the early 1800s this had become a modest, unremarkable community of a few thousand people, known mostly for its tanneries, its carriage works, and a small Lutheran theological seminary on a low ridge just west of town. The people who farmed those fields, milked those cows, and worshipped in those small brick churches had absolutely no reason to believe their town's name would ever be known outside their own county. They were living ordinary agricultural lives, rooted in Scots Irish and German Pennsylvania Dutch heritage, utterly unaware of what those same roads converging on their town would one day funnel toward them. By the summer of 1863, this unremarkable crossroads town had grown to roughly 2,400 residents, and it possessed exactly the kind of infrastructure that made it strategically important without anyone planning it that way. The very thing that had made it a good trading town, all those roads meeting in one place, made it a magnet for 2 enormous armies. When fighting broke out on July 1, 1863, it wasn't because anyone had chosen this town for its symbolism. It was because soldiers marching along those old roads simply collided here. Over 3 days, in the fields, orchards, and low hills surrounding the town, roughly 160,000 soldiers fought the largest battle ever waged on the North American continent, and by the time it ended, more than 50,000 men were counted as dead, wounded, captured, or missing. The town's buildings themselves became part of the machinery of war. The seminary building on the ridge, with its distinctive cupola, was used first as a lookout post and then as a field hospital, its wooden floors soaked and its hallways lined with wounded men on makeshift cots. The courthouse and the town's churches were converted into hospitals as well, and for weeks afterward, this quiet crossroads town remained one enormous open wound, still being patched and repaired even as the armies marched away. Before the battle, though, and even in its uneasy aftermath, this had always been a place with a real civic and spiritual heart. At the center of town sat the Diamond, a town square lined with shops, hotels, and a small courthouse where local disputes were settled and town meetings were held. German Reformed, Lutheran, Catholic, and Methodist congregations each had their own modest brick or stone churches, and residents moved between English and Pennsylvania German dialects depending on who they were speaking to. Layers of different waves of settlement were visible in the town's architecture itself, older log structures giving way to more formal Federal and Greek Revival brick buildings as the community grew more prosperous through the early 1800s. This was a place with its own rhythms of order, its own courts and congregations and civic pride, all of it entirely ordinary until the events of that one July. Daily life before the battle had the texture of any small American market town in that era. Shopkeepers swept their storefronts along Baltimore Street and Chambersburg Street. The smell of fresh bread mixed with the sharper scent of leather from the tanneries and the earthy smell of livestock being driven in from surrounding farms on market days. Children ran errands between shops. Local newspapers printed notices of land sales, church socials, and the increasingly ominous war news drifting in from the south. Class lines existed, as they did everywhere, between the town's more prosperous merchants and professionals and its laborers, tenant farmers, and small free black community, whose members lived under the constant threat of being seized and sold into slavery by Confederate raiders even though they were legally free. The Diamond Square itself served as this town's great gathering place, its version of a public forum, where farmers sold produce, politicians gave speeches, and news both good and terrible was first announced to the crowd. On the wealthier edge of town stood homes like that of David Wills, a prominent local attorney whose comfortable brick residence just off the Diamond reflected the modest but genuine prosperity available to a successful professional in a country town like this. Fine furniture, tasteful moldings, a study lined with legal volumes, all of it signaled a life of relative comfort and social standing. Yet whatever safety, wealth, and position seemed to promise, the war that arrived in July of 1863 did not spare the privileged any more than the poor. Cannon fire did not check a homeowner's ledger before tearing through a roof, and in the battle's aftermath, even the town's most comfortable houses were pressed into service as hospitals, their fine parlors filled with wounded and dying soldiers regardless of who owned the deed. It was in the aftermath of that battle that the true turning point of our story unfolds, and it has less to do with cannon fire than with a decision about what to do with the dead. In the weeks after the fighting ended, thousands of soldiers lay in hastily dug, shallow graves scattered across the battlefield, and it became clear that a permanent, dignified burial ground was needed. David Wills, that same local attorney, helped spearhead the creation of a new soldiers' national cemetery on Cemetery Hill, and he was tasked with organizing its formal dedication. The featured speaker chosen for that November day was Edward Everett, one of the most celebrated orators in America, a man expected to speak for close to 2 hours, weaving together classical rhetoric and detailed battle narrative in the grand oratorical style of the age. Almost as an afterthought, organizers invited President Abraham Lincoln to offer what the official program called only a few appropriate remarks. Lincoln arrived by train the evening before, and by most accounts, spent that night and the following morning refining a short address, believed to have gone through several handwritten drafts, weighing every word with the same care a sculptor gives a final chisel stroke. When his turn came, after Everett had indeed spoken for nearly 2 hours to sustained applause, Lincoln rose, and in barely 2 minutes, delivered remarks so brief that some witnesses later said the photographer assigned to capture the moment did not even have time to properly focus his camera before the president had already returned to his seat. In roughly 270 words, he reframed the meaning of the war itself, tying the sacrifice on that battlefield to the founding principles of the nation and to an unfinished promise of human equality. The crowd's reaction in the moment was reportedly muted, more respectful silence than roaring applause, and many newspapers the next day gave far more column space to Everett's lengthy oration than to the president's brief remarks. In the moment, most people in that crowd believed they had just witnessed a dedication ceremony headlined by a famous scholar, with a short courtesy statement from the president. What they had actually witnessed, though few realized it yet, was a redefinition of what the American experiment was for. In the years that followed, the town of Gettysburg slowly returned to something like its old rhythms, even as the battlefield around it became hallowed, half-forgotten ground, its trenches and earthworks slowly softened by grass and weather. Yet unlike so many historical sites, this place was never truly buried or lost. Instead, something quieter happened. Lincoln's brief remarks, initially treated almost as a footnote, gradually grew in stature over the following decades, reprinted, memorized by schoolchildren, and eventually recognized by historians and the public alike as one of the most powerful pieces of political rhetoric ever delivered in the English language, even as Everett's much longer speech faded from memory entirely. Historians and archivists have since carefully studied the handful of surviving handwritten drafts of Lincoln's remarks, each slightly different, each bearing his own corrections and revisions, and the process of comparing them has offered scholars an extraordinary window into exactly how carefully those brief sentences were shaped and reshaped before delivery. What continues to surprise people even now is the sheer economy of the thing, how a document so short could carry so much weight, especially when set beside the far longer, more conventionally celebrated oration it was originally meant to accompany. It's worth pausing here briefly to remember that this was never just a symbolic backdrop. It was a real town, with real bakeries and real classrooms and real families who woke up one July morning to find their fields and streets transformed into a battlefield, and who spent months afterward nursing wounded strangers in their own parlors. The soldiers buried on that hillside were sons, husbands, and brothers, each with a name and a home somewhere else in the country, not simply statistics carved into stone. If you visit Gettysburg today, you'll find that remarkable amount of this story still standing, still walkable. The diamond still anchors the town center, now lined with shops and restaurants rather than tanneries, though several original 19th century buildings remain. The Wills House still stands just off the square, now preserved as a museum where visitors can see the very room where Lincoln is believed to have stayed and finalized his remarks the night before delivering them. The old seminary building on its ridge still bears its distinctive cupola, now part of a museum dedicated to the building's wartime service as a hospital. The Soldiers' National Cemetery on Cemetery Hill remains a working cemetery and a place of quiet reflection, its rows of modest headstones curving gently across the hillside almost exactly where that crowd once gathered to listen. A large bronze memorial now marks the approximate location where Lincoln is believed to have stood, and visitors from around the world walk that same ground every year, often surprised by how small and unassuming the actual spot feels, given the outsized weight of what was said there. The wider battlefield surrounding the town has been preserved as a national military park. Its monuments, cannon, and stone